think we are live. Hi, hello everybody. Are we audible? Can you just drop a text in the chat box? Okay, so good evening everyone. It's very nice that now we are going to have our third session, and Professor Greenfield today will talk about what is mind. So I think you all are very well acquainted with what is humanity as of now, and the state of social sciences, and how all of these are interlinked with each other. And in the last few sessions with all of your question, I think you must be eager to know more and more. And so Professor Greenfield, I think we can start. We already have a lots of participants, and I request all of you to take this session seriously. If you will be joining it live, you may ask question, you may clarify your doubts, and if you may think that you can watch recordings later on, that is also an option for you, since we are not making attendance compulsory. But I would encourage all of you to attend live sessions. Thank you. So over to you, Professor Greenfield. Now you may start with your community.
Thank you. Good evening. As Monica said, I hope you're following the logical stream of the argument and how every next subject derives directly from logically from what we have previously discussed. So in the beginning, we raised the question, as Monica already said, why do we need the science of humanity? From that, we moved to the question of what is humanity? What is this subject? We have defined it as symbolic reality, so dependent on the nature of symbols. And now, as we are discussing the mind, we see how the mind can be deduced from the nature of symbols, right? So we have to return a little bit to symbols. What are symbols? In distinction to science, right? They are arbitrary. So symbols are arbitrary signs. They're not directly connected to what they signify. They are connected to what they signify because we decide so. It is our decision. It is our decision that they would signify what they do signify. So their meanings change with the context in which they are used. And the contexts change constantly. They change with the addition of every new symbol to the context. So we know that the past context leads to the present context, modifies the present context, and the present context necessarily modifies the future context. The changes thus occur in time. This fact means that symbolic reality is a temporal phenomenon. It is not a spatial phenomenon, as everything material is. Everything material is a spatial phenomenon. It occurs in space. Symbols occur in time. So it is a temporal phenomenon. And this means that symbolic reality is a process. It is not a structure. It is a process. The symbolic process, and when we talk about temporal process, we imply that it is essentially historical, again, defined by the dependence of the present on the past and the future on the present. Historical. The symbolic process, that is, the constant assignment and reassignment of meanings to symbols, or in other words, their interpretation, occurs in the mind. The mind is supported by, must be supported by the brain, so symbolic reality occurs within the boundary conditions of life, of the organic reality. The brain is a spatial phenomenon. It is an organ. It occupies certain space. But the mind, which is supported by the brain, is itself a process. It happens in time. And it is analogous to certain other organic processes which are happening with the support of organs. So other temporal phenomena supported by spatial organic phenomena. So they are very strictly analogous. The process of the mind is very strictly analogous to the process of digestion, for example, which is what is happening to the food in the stomach, or the process of breathing, which is what is happening to air in the lungs. The mind, specifically, is the processing of symbolic stimuli, culture in the brain. This makes culture both a historical and a mental phenomenon. So when we are discussing culture, history and psychology are necessarily parts of this discussion. And the science of humanity must necessarily include history and psychology. Moreover, the science of humanity, whatever we study in humanity, whatever subject we study whatever human affair. Maybe we study politics. Maybe we study, for example, Indian nationalism. Or maybe we study the arranged marriages in India. Study of humanity necessitates a constant focus on the individual. Those of you who are familiar with Weber, you know that Weber advocates methodological individualism. So methodologically, the science of humanity must be focused on the individual. And the human individual is defined, please pay attention to that, because to a certain extent, this statement may appear contradicted by some other statements in this lecture, but it is not at all. The human individual is defined as a culturally constituted being. The mind then defined as individualized culture, the cultural process on the individual level, on the level of the individual. Or it can be defined, the mind, as culture in the brain. Now, although culture, and although the mind is the creative element in culture, its creativity, the creativity of our individual mind, is necessarily oriented by cultural stimuli operating on it from the outside. So the symbolic process, just like the organic process in life, takes place on the individual and the collective levels at once, inside the mind and outside the mind. Like the genetic mutations in the process of life, change is always the possibility because the mind is creative. But the nature of the change, and thus the direction of evolution in the case of life, and the direction of history in the case of humanity, can never be predicted. Now, it is very important to remember that your mind, the mind of everyone, as all of you know, is the central part of our living experience. If you think, for example, for a moment, what have you experienced today? It is now evening in India, and you can just take into consideration the first 20 minutes or an hour of your morning, you will see that all of your experiences, all that you actually experienced, happened in your mind. This means that for all of us, all of you, what you experience in your mind is direct empirical knowledge. Nobody can tell you that it didn't happen. You know it happened. And this is the only direct and empirical knowledge human beings have access to. This, in turn, means that science of humanity is the only science in which we have at least some access to direct empirical knowledge. Neither in physics, and we consider it, of course, the most important empirical science, nor in biology, another very important empirical science, we have any access to the direct empirical knowledge. We only have such access in the science of humanity. On the other hand, all knowledge about life and material reality is necessarily indirect, mediated by our beliefs, or they can be called prejudices, including in the modern scientific age. By our belief in the reliability of our perceptions, which, however, are revealed to us by the mind. That is our belief in the objectivity of our subjective experience, because our experience of the mind is subjective. I do hope that you had the chance to read my 2 posts, which were preparations for this lecture, because what I say is very new and very, very complex. And for you to understand that, it is good for you to actually think about it for a couple of times. So let me repeat the main takeaway about the mind, okay? The mind is a process. It is similar to such processes as digestion or breathing. In all the 3 cases, stimuli from outside of the organism are processed by the means of a bodily organ. The stomach processes food, but the stomach is not the same as digestion. The stomach is a stomach, a spatial phenomenon. The lungs process air, but then again, they're not the same as breathing. Breathing is one thing, a process. The lungs are certain spatial phenomena, bodily organs. And the brain processes perceptions, signs, things that signify to us, and symbols. But the brain obviously is not identical to mental processing. Like digestion, it does mental processing, and mental processing is not the same as the brain. But not all mental processing is the mind. Like digestion and breathing, mental processing necessarily changes, and its effect changes dramatically with the nature of the stimuli from the outside, which are processed. And the stimuli from the outside are not at all dependent on the organism. So, for example, we know now that we pay attention everywhere at the nutrition, at what we eat, we know that digestion of fats, digestion of carbohydrates, the digestion of proteins result in very different digestion. What is happening is quite different. What is happening in the stomach is quite different. And of course, the digestion of poisons is completely different from the digestion of good food, right? And this does not depend on the nature of the stomach. The stomach can be perfect. In every case, poison would kill the organism. The digestion of poison would lead to death. The digestion of good food would continue life. The same lungs of exactly in the same condition, would breathe both oxygen and carbon monoxide. The results of this breathing by perfect lungs would be completely different. And so think, in a brain of the same intelligence and problem-solving capacity, the processing of signs would be different from the processing of symbols. And only processing of symbols is the mind. And this kind of process sharply distinguishes humanity from animals who are just animals. On the other hand, animals who are not only biological organisms, but also culturally constituted beings are human. So the human animal, the Homo sapiens animal, who are only Homo sapiens animal and not culturally constituted being, is not human. This means that a newborn infant of two human beings is not human, but a dog who shares with us our cultural environment, and dogs necessarily share with us our cultural environment. These dogs are culturally constituted beings and are human. So, from the nature, you see, this just follows from the nature of symbols. Now, from the nature of symbols and symbolic processes, one can also logically deduce what in fact is happening in the mind. This is very important because we can see our own mind. We do experience our own mind. And if we analyze it and exercise introspection carefully, we really can describe what is happening in our mind. But we also can describe what is happening in the mind in general, in the mind of others. Just knowing the nature of symbolic environment, which we all can see. So we can derive from the nature of symbols and symbolic environment, we can derive from that hypothesis regarding the inner structure or anatomy of the mind, which can then be methodically tested against empirical evidence. And this evidence would be historical, psychological, psychiatric, and even neuroscientific. The variability of human social orders is a function of the fact that human ways of life are constituted and transmitted symbolically rather than genetically. And this implies that in contrast to all other animals, with the exception of our pets, to all other animals who are born into a specific ordered world, which is clearly organized by their genes, and by definition, by the environment to which they are genetically adapted, right? They are born into a specific order. But human beings, whether Homo sapiens or dogs, are born into a world with numerous, potentially mutually exclusive possibilities. And very early on in life, in early childhood, every human being must be able to adapt themselves to the possibilities that happen to be realized around them. So if you take a tiny puppy who is taken from her mother and brought into a home of people, this tiny puppy, already at the age of 2 months, will start understanding, adapting itself to this cultural environment. Not being genetically equipped for any particular possibility, humans in the first years of their life, if they are Homo sapiens humans, or in the first months of their lives, if they're dogs, must grow certain adaptive mechanisms for focusing on such possibilities. And these mechanisms are the constituent processes of the mind. Two of those processes can be logically deduced from the essential indeterminateness, the arbitrary, variable, potentially variable character of human social orders. These are identity and will. No other animal, unless we're talking of pets, has a need in identity and will, a need in those adaptive mechanisms, because their positions vis-a-vis other members of their group and their actions under all likely circumstances, that is, the circumstances of their species' adaptive niche, are genetically dictated. Being genetically unique, each animal has individuality, but only human individual character has this adaptive, subjective dimension. Identity and will constitute functional requirements of the human individual's adaptation to the indeterminate cultural environment. Identity and will represent the different aspects of the self, of the I. Identity is a relationally constituted self, and will is the acting self or agency. Now, identity may be understood as symbolic self-definition. It is the image of one's position in a sociocultural space within a larger image of the relevant sociocultural terrain. The larger image is an individualized microcosm of a particular culture in which one is immersed. A mental map of the various aspects of the sociocultural environment, analogous to representations of the changing spatial environment yielded by the specific spatial place cells discovered in the neurological experiments with rodents, like indications of a rat's place on the spatial mental map. The human identity map defines the individual's possibilities of adaptation to the sociocultural environment. Because the environment is so complex, however, the human individual, unlike a rat, is presented in the map with various possibilities of adaptations, which cannot be objectively and clearly ranked. That's why they must be ranked subjectively. That is, the individual must choose and decide which of those possibilities of adaptation to pursue. This subjective ranking of options is a function of the general character of the mental map. So it would be very different in India, for example, and in the United States. The subjective map, the identity map, would be very different, would depend upon what place in it is occupied, let's say, by God, and what place is occupied by the afterlife, or what place is occupied by Brahman, or by the nation, or by one's caste, and so on. And where one is placed on this map in relation to such other presences. While identity serves as a representation and agent of a particular culture, the culture in which the individual is immersed, the will is a function of the symbolic process in general. That is, it reflects the intentionality of symbols. Because human actions, except involuntary reflexes, are not determined reactions, but products of decision and choice. So imagine, for example, a girl is introduced to a boy in the circumstances of possibly arranged marriage, right? Now this girl may say, yes, I'm going to marry this boy, I like this boy. Or she can say, no, I don't like this boy. Those would be completely different decisions and completely different actions, right? The nature of the human response to any stimulus is indeterminate. It is the will that steps in, as it were, in a split-second intermediate stage between stimulus and reaction, deciding in that moment what the response will be. Now, we usually apply the word consciousness to those moments of decision.
2 more minutes.
Yes. But actually, unless the decision is problematic in some way, those moments of decision are usually unconscious. Now, given the character of the human environment, of the symbolic environment, the logical reasons for the existence of identity and will are rather obvious. Both those processes are necessary for the individual's adaptation to the human environment and therefore for the individual's survival. They're discoverable, only logical, like, by the way, gravity in physics or evolution in biology. And they remain hypothetical until tested against empirical evidence. But this is not so as regards the thinking component of the mind, the thinking I, or the I of self-consciousness. Each person is aware of thinking, is aware of a thinking I, because it is the thinking I that we experience as our mind. Its existence, therefore, is known directly through experience, in other words, empirically. And this knowledge is absolute and certain. This is the only such knowledge we possess. The thinking I, interestingly, is not necessary for the individual's adaptation to the sociocultural environment or to one's survival in it. For example, think about that. A dog would not have a thinking I. A dog would use would have very few such self-conscious moments. But it is not necessary. What is necessary for dogs' adaptation would be unself-conscious processes. But the I of self-consciousness is a necessary condition for the culture process on the collective level. The I of self-consciousness, the thinking I, makes possible self-consciousness for every single individual human. But as the process of self-conscious thought, the one explicitly symbolic process among all symbolic mental processes, it makes possible indirect learning and thereby the transmission of human ways of life across generations and distances. It is an essentially symbolic process, similar to the development of language, of musical tradition, of elaboration of a theorem, and to the transmission of culture in general, in the sense that it actually operates with symbolic means, with formal symbols, the formal means, media of symbolic expression. And this means that thought is always dependent on language. Our thought only extends as far as the possibilities of the formal symbolic medium in which it operates. Okay?
Yes. So I think now we may stop. It's already 45 minutes. You
Oi.
talk 5 minutes extra. That's so nice of you. We have few questions in line. So would you like to take one by one? So the
Yes.
first says, I think it's a doubt from Satyavan. It says, what is the component of mind? How do we say, or how
Mhm.
do we define it?
Yes. The components of mind, um, analytically, one can distinguish three specific processes in the process of mind. And how do we discover those three specific processes in the general process of mind? We deduce the first two, identity and will. We deduce these two from the nature of the symbolic environment. And we understand that it is a functional requirement for adaptation and survival of the individual human being. The third component we are actually aware of. We are aware of it because we see it, we experience it. So the explanation of the first two is logical. The explanation of the third one is empirical. But it also has a logical explanation because it is a functional requirement for the cultural process as a whole. How do we, those are the first two, identity and will, are deduced logically, like gravity in physics or like evolution in biology. They're deduced logically. But then they can be tested against the evidence of their action. There will be evidence of their action. See, Newton thought, oh, there must be gravity. There must be this force that causes objects to fall downwards, you know? And then he sits under a tree and an apple under the apple tree, and an apple falls on him. This is the evidence of gravity. In the case of identity and will, the evidence can be derived from a sick mind, a mind that is disintegrates. So, for example, if one doesn't have a clear identity, one's will is necessarily affected and one cannot act. One is unable to act. One is unable to control one's actions. And those actions can be both actions as in thinking and actions as in acting. So this then accumulates gives us a lot of evidence for proving the existence of those hypothetical forces.
You want to take another question? I think you have already covered it a bit, but it says that can professor explain how I thinking is necessary for the transfer of symbolic reality in the science of humanity? Is it possible to fully separate the thinking I from the processes of identity and will?
Through analytically, it is possible. Analytically. In general, of course, the mind, especially healthy mind, functions like one process. But analytically, it is possible. And how does it accomplish the transmission of human ways of life? It makes it externalizes our processing, externalizes the processing of symbolic stimuli. That is, makes it possible, visible, perceptible to others. For example, here I am creating this science of humanity. I'm using words to externalize that. And now you are aware of my thoughts because I externalized them in words. And now I am transmitting my thoughts to you. Now you imbibe those thoughts in your many minds. And I'm explaining to you how this works. And you understand my explanations. And you can then explain this to somebody who is not familiar with me. You can discuss it with your friends, you see, and then maybe at a certain point, you will be practicing the science of humanity and you will be writing about it. In the case, let's say, of arranged versus love marriages in India, and somebody completely different reading your articles will be able to have this way of life, this practicing of science of humanity transmitted to them. So learn this indirectly through many, many other indirect channels. This is how it is essential because it is explicit. It is made explicit and therefore can be externalized.
Thank you. There is one more question from Shreya. She says that I'm confused if empirical knowledge like physics draw from the mental perception of the phenomena. Should they also be considered as social science?
No, no. Uh, um, they shouldn't be considered a social science. They should be considered as physical science because it is a knowledge about the particular material aspect of our reality. You know, for example, you can have a big table in front of you and you walk towards it and you bump into it. This is the kind of experience you have. This is the way you experience matter, you see? But nevertheless, you only experience it through your mind. You see, for example, you bump into the table and you experience pain, right? It is through your mind. It is mentally that you experience pain. Or you're trying to understand why you experience pain. And this, at this you arrive at logically through your thinking, again through your mind. But what you are trying to understand in this case is the material phenomena, the material aspect of reality. You are not trying to understand the human aspect of reality.
There is one from Dr. Minarul. He says that, hello, Professor, mind controls the brain or brain controls the mind? I would like to hear your opinion.
Mhm.
Maybe this would be the last
Yeah,
question.
this is a very, very interesting question. Very. Think about a food processor and think about food, right? What controls the food that is processed? The food processing in the food processor. Is it the food processor, the machine? Or is it the food that you go buy in the market and put into the food processor? It is neither this nor the other, right? They are both necessary. The food processor, the machine, is essential for processing the food. But if you don't have the food that you bought in the market, the machine wouldn't do anything. It certainly doesn't control the food. You have to go to the market and buy there. Now, with the question of the mind has to contain those three elements. Has to contain identity, will, and it really doesn't have to contain the I, the thinking I, because it is essential for the culture in general, not the survival of the individual human being. Try to think about a dog. A dog does have an identity and does have a will. Those are very important parts of a dog's mind. Now, but those are given to our brains, the Homo sapiens brain, like food processor, or dog's brain. Those are given to us by our cultural environment. It is only our identity in an environment that we create a map of identity. But now imagine that, and this happens very often, certainly in the Western society, and hopefully not so often in Indian society. There are lots of people who live in an environment which is so terribly contradictory that they do not know any longer who they are, what they are. They think, for example, oh, I was born a boy, but actually, I think maybe I am a girl. This tears them apart, right? As a result, their brain may be completely perfect, a perfect, healthy organ, but the environment creates such poisonous situation for them that they no longer can control their actions. And so a person whose identity is no longer definable, this person also cannot act, doesn't have a will. The will of such a person is terribly impaired. So, who controls what? Depends on the circumstances, right? When you have a sick brain, then it is possible you wouldn't develop a healthy mind. But if you live in a sick culture and your mind is sick, then no healthy brain would ever help you. So again, think about food processor, which is a machine, and food that you buy in the market. What controls what? Neither this nor that. It is their cooperation that is important. Mhm.
Uh, okay, I think now we can stop, and it's already time. And thank you, Professor Greenfield, for your time, and thank you all of you for joining. And I can see there are lots of participants today, but a lot, uh, yeah. So some of the participants are absent without prior notice. So I think it's not on time, and then you should drop at least your name in the chat box, so we would be able to familiar who is watching our lecture continually and who is not. So I think we may now stop. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mhm.